So, as someone who actually comes out of teaching English, not history, I'm really delighted to have somebody from the English department that's coming to end our session, pull us out of that narrow trench of history discipline, a wider and beautiful world of language arts. So Parama Roy is from the English department at UC Davis, and she is. Well, she's working in many things, but I've asked her to come and talk about famine in South Asia. And I think rather than just sort of start talking about things you may not be talking about, I'll let you introduce the rest.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me, and thank you also for being here on this beautiful afternoon to listen to what may not be the most cheery of topics. So it's an honor to be here. Now, I know that earlier today you've heard one presentation on China and Ireland. You can still hear me at the back? Okay. And now mine is also an account from one of the proverbial lands of famine. I mean, in India, along with China, Russia, and so on, and Ireland, counts as one of the proverbial lands of famine. So I would like to speak today about famine in the British Empire, and most specifically, famine in colonial Bengal. And I will focus now on two famines that bookended British rule in the subcontinent. So the first, the famine of 1770, which occurs about a dozen years after the British achieve a certain kind of paramountcy in the subcontinent. And the second one, which occurs in 1943 during the Second World War, and which has been described as one of the forgotten famines of the 20th century, since it was absorbed, as it were, into the larger and more compelling narrative of the Second World War. So these are the two famines that I will talk about.
So is it 1943?
Sorry, 1943. I beg your pardon. Oh, that's a hideous error. So I hope this is the only one among them. Okay. You see, sorry, 1770 and 1943. Yeah. So, okay. And so what I'm going to say can be glossed as something of a meditation on the relationship between famine and the policies of the colonial state. But partly I will also be speaking about famine in general. Okay. And because I am, as Michelle pointed out, a literary scholar by training, at least some of what I will be talking about will be literary in nature. So there will be a literary supplement to the largely historical materials that we will be talking about today. And so if, I have time, I will speak to some degree about the representations of these famines, especially the later famine, the famine of 1943, in the ethnography, the art, and the fiction and the visual culture of the period. And if it is at all possible, and if there is time, I would like to pause very briefly to think about the famine as a gendered phenomenon, and to think specifically about the gendered iconography of these famines, especially of the 1943 famine, which tended to focus a great deal of attention on the suffering of women, right? But that comes at the end. Now, I don't really have any idea of how often you have taught about famine. I came to know that some of you, in fact, teach it fairly routinely. So it is possible that I might be droning on about things that are entirely familiar to you. So if I get, tedious about these things, please feel free to tell me to move on. Likewise, if I am at points too telegraphic, in the points that I wish to make, again, please feel free to interrupt and ask for clarifications. Okay. So let's see. I'd like to begin then again, not with either the famine of 1770 or the famine of 1943, but I'd like to begin with a different kind of frame, right? And this frame consists of two texts by Rudyard Kipling, written in the last decade of the 19th century, right? And together they provide something of a snapshot, if you will, of a British imperial mythology of famine and of famine relief. Right? Now, the first text is a stanza from The White Man's Burden, which, is a poem I'm sure you know relatively well. And as you know, this was written in 1898, published in 1899, and written in part for Teddy Roosevelt, right? And this was written right at the point when the United States was poised to become an imperial power, right? And it's an extraordinary poem in many ways, right? Hateful to some degree, but, also quite extraordinary in the kind of vision that it imagines, of a British empire. And it's a vision of an empire as sacrificial labor, not so much as triumphalist achievement, but as sacrificial labor, right? And hence it is the white man's burden, as it were, right? And so Kipling is very emphatic about underlining the labor of the imperial administrator or the imperial bureaucrat as a kind of labor that receives no compensation whatsoever, right? And it receives no compensation even in the coin of gratitude from natives, who, being natives, of course, are ungrateful for what is done to them, right? But it is nonetheless a needful labor as Kipling sees it, and it is a labor of heroes and of gods. And look at, for instance, the third and fourth lines over here, and the way in which Kipling imagines the work of the imperial bureaucrat as filling full the mouth of famine and bidding the sickness cease, right? So it's both a kind of a making good the lack that exists in the colony, but it's also about assuming a certain kind of godlike status, right? It is about bidding the sickness cease, right? I mean, you just tell it to cease and it ceases. It's not making the sickness cease, but bidding it by fiat to cease, right? And I'd like for us now also to look at a second text which will form part of this frame. And I apologize for the poor quality of this image. I mean, I've tried and tried and tried to get, higher resolution version of this image, but this is really the best that I could do. And this is an illustration from a story that Kipling wrote in 1896 and published in the Ladies' Home Journal, called William the Conqueror, right? And this is a love story, and it is very specifically a love story in conditions of imperial crisis, right? And the title character, William or Wilhelmina, the one who is standing there at the opening to the tent, right? That's William, right? She falls in love with Scott, who is a British engineer, the figure on the right, who is sort of marching off, off the frame. And she falls in love with him when she discovers his capacity for unremittingly taxing and resourceful labor in the relief camps at a famine area in South India. And it's interesting, in the story, you have almost nothing that you would recognize as courtship between these two figures, right? And in this picture, you see, I mean, this is the moment of a revelation for William, right? And this is presented as a kind of a vision where she sees him, you know, almost for the first time in this capacity as this heroic administrator, right? And he's sort of clad in a kind of full glory, right? And so, you know, we find that they look not at each other, right? Rather, she looks at him as he comes back to the camp at the end of a long day, sort of godlike, lit up by some kind of extra diegetic source of light, which is outside of the frame, right? At the head of a herd of goats. I hope you can make out the goats in the middle of the frame, right? So a shepherd, right? And he's set the goats to work producing milk for the crowd of Indian children whom you find clustering around him, right? So here he's followed by flocks of children, flocks of goats, right? And this is the sort of moment where Kipling makes clear that his actions of milking the goats and feeding the children, right, symbolically produce the state as, you know, a genuine giver of life, right? So the state comes to function as a kind of parent, right? It functions in loco parentis, feeding the hungry, feeding the children, right, who are dependents upon them, right? And so the story seems to imply that when life is in crisis in the colony, these self-effacing servants of the empire, overflowing with the milk of human kindness, nurture these children. They competently minister to them in these government-run refugee camps. And this is a kind of very interesting, if rather tendentious staging of the state's overarching responsibility, right? Almost a parental responsibility for life in the colony, which is always juvenile, always susceptible to scarcity, always unable to take care of itself in a state of nonage, if you will. And so this is, you know, Kipling's fable of imperial service, especially in times of emergency. Now, I would like for us to keep this frame in mind now as we turn to the actual historical accounts of famine. Now, I will begin this time with the British East India Company. Now, as you undoubtedly know, I mean, the story of the East India Company's transformation from a trading company into a paramount power, a paramount imperial power in the subcontinent is a long and somewhat complicated one. Now, and you know, it's helpful to begin actually a little before, you know, the founding itself of the East India Company. Now, medieval and early modern Europe, as you know, hungered for the spices of the subcontinent and of Southeast Asia. And these spices were used in a variety of ways: for embalming, for magical rituals, for cooking, for preservation, for aphrodisiacs, as cosmetics, as perfumes, in medications, and so on, right? And they were endowed with considerable glamour and value, right? And their possession and use was a mark of conspicuous consumption and of discriminating taste among European elites, right, who were seeking to consolidate certain claims to refinement. And Wolfgang Schivelbusch, who's written a really interesting history on the taste for spices, says that in fact it was this taste for spices that served as a kind of engine, if you will, of European growth, right? Transforming it or launching it from medievalism to modernity through these long sea voyages and subsequent colonial conquests that it undertook in order to gather these spices, right? So he sees spices as the desire for spices as a kind of engine, a certain kind of motor, if you will, of European development. And for over 3 centuries, the lucrative European spice trade with the East was dependent, as you know, upon land routes across Asia and the Middle East, and upon primarily Arab and Venetian intermediaries. But by the 16th century, improvements in navigational techniques had led the other European powers to seek the fabled spices directly. And then you have, of course, sea captains like Ferdinand Magellan and Vasco da Gama, who were instrumental in opening up the sea routes to the east and ensuring Portuguese monopoly over the pepper trade until other European powers, including the Dutch, the British, and the French in particular, decided to challenge this Portuguese hegemony. Now, the British East India Company, which was established by a royal charter from Elizabeth I, began as a trading company, trading first in textiles, indigo, saltpeter, spices, opium, tea, etc., in India, Southeast Asia, and the South China Sea. Now, by the middle of the 17th century, the company had erected factories and fortifications and gained exclusive rights to operate in and trade with Bengal. Okay, we'll come to this in just a second. Now, from the early 18th century onwards, the trade of Bengal had grown ever more profitable to the company, accounting by 1750 for 75% of the company's procurement of Indian goods. And Bengal itself came to be mythologized in Britain as a kind of a Garden of Eden, right? Possessing, all kinds of commercial and natural advantages with, rice fields producing on a scale, unknown anywhere else, with spices, sugar, oils, in profusion, rivers overflowing with fish, coastal islands with salt, etc., right? So there's this sense of Edenic profusion, of abundance, etc., right? And by the mid-8th, so it was, of course, a very desirable place to inhabit, a desirable place to control, and to have taxation rights over, etc., right? And this is precisely what the British proceed to do by the mid-18th century. So by the mid-18th century, the company had begun to establish its paramountcy in the subcontinent, subduing its French rivals as well as numerous Indian rulers, most notably at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the Battle of Buxar in 1764, and by plundering the treasury of Bengal. Now, in 1765, it wrested what was called the Diwani of Bengal, which is to say the right to collect taxes of Bengal from its defeated Indian rivals, thereby gaining the rights to revenue collection of a large and prosperous province. And this is what you see here in, I don't know how to operate this, but anyway, this is what you see here in this very famous painting by Benjamin West, where you see, actually, this is the Mughal emperor who is handing over the rights to tax collection to Robert Clive, who is the conqueror of Bengal.
Push the red down.
Okay. Okay. There's Clive over there receiving, the rights to collect taxes in Bengal from the Mughal emperor over here in the aftermath of this military defeat, right? And this was, of course, a tremendously important event, which is why it's monumentalized, several decades later by a very well-known Academy painter. Now, as a result of this, as a result of gaining what is called the Diwani of Bengal, it was no longer simply a British company trading in Bengal, right? It was now the governor of the province, right? And it was now responsible for law enforcement, and it was responsible for civil administration and not just for tax collection, right? And so 1765 is an important date that marks a certain transformation in the character and the responsibilities of the East India Company in Bengal. Okay. Now, the company was not the first governing entity to be interested in the surpluses that Bengal could produce, right? I mean, the Mughal Empire, whose rule had preceded that of the British, had also been interested in extracting surpluses, from Bengal to the degree that was possible. But the company intensified these forms of extraction, and tax demands escalated under its rule through the course of the 18th century. And this is a map of India in 1760, and this is the area known as Bengal. This is at the mouth of the Ganges. It's, quite a large and prosperous province. And and this is a map of Bengal itself, also from 1760. And this is a map from a couple of decades later, which tells you, what kinds of gains the British had made by the 1780s or thereabouts. And you see that they have a stretch of land here along the southeastern coast. They have a couple of, factories out here, etc. There's Madras down here, known as Fort St. George, that is also part of their possession, but by far the largest bit of territory that they possess is the part that is shaded here in pink, and that is Bengal, right? Okay. So as I said, the East India Company intensified these forms of revenue extraction, and tax demands escalated under its rule. And this was driven by a desire to enlarge revenue, and also by its employees' ambitions of building private fortunes, right? And so the 18th century is the moment when, people go out, young men go out from Britain to India in order to build fortunes, in order to become rich and to return as what were called nabobs, right? So very wealthy men who then came back to India and tried to transform that kind of colonial capital into some kind of capital in the metropolis, running for parliament, marrying above them, buying up land, etc. Right? So all this is as a result of the high rates of taxation, which didn't necessarily go into the company's coffers, but went to form the private fortunes of the company's employees. Right? Now, this fiscal squeeze, historians suggest, which amounted essentially to a scheme for the private enrichment of company employees under the guise of revenue collection, drained the treasury of the province and put increasingly greater tax burdens on an impoverished agricultural class. Now, many among this class had also been forced into the cultivation of cash crops like indigo rather than food grains, and this in times of famine led them into a greater degree of vulnerability. So these communities became increasingly vulnerable to scarcity and famine, as did the artisan classes that did not live off the land, right? So they too were susceptible to high prices and to food deficits. So now the famine of 1770. Now this famine was preceded by partial crop failure due to the failure of the monsoon in Bengal and Bihar in 1768. By September 1769, there was a severe drought and there were alarming reports of rural distress, which made little impact on company officials, it must be said. By early in the year in 1770, there was starvation, and by the middle of the year, there were extraordinarily large-scale deaths from starvation and widespread destitution. In some provinces, we are told, a third of the populace perished. Several districts were laid waste as people died or abandoned their residences for neighboring states where the tax burdens were less onerous, right? So a number of people fled to Nepal, where they had to pay much less in taxes. Now, many cultivated lands were abandoned and they returned to jungle. All through the summer of 1770, people starved to death. Now, writing an account of the famine a century later, the British official W. Hunter, who looked at the record of the famine nearly a century later, wrote, "The peasants sold their cattle, they sold their implements of agriculture, they devoured their seed grain, they sold their sons and daughters, till at length no buyer of children could be found. They ate the leaves of trees and the grass of the field, and in June 1770, the resident at the Darbar, that is to say the British resident at the Darbar, affirmed that the living were feeding on the dead." Now, we have here a catalogue of escalating disaster and dispossession, starting with the loss of animals and tools, proceeding to the loss of children, and ending finally in a state that is both degraded, which involves eating of grass, like an animal, as well as horrific, right? So you have survivor cannibalism. Now, almost all famines produce tales of cannibalism, and undoubtedly, you have heard some of them. But of course, hard evidence is almost never to be found, and this is true for cannibalism in general, not just the survivor cannibalism of the famine, right? And so we might be best served by seeing this not so much as an empirically demonstrable fact, but as a form of rhetorical overstretch, which is appropriate to conditions of extremity, right? So the imagination itself is beggared, right, by the scope of this disaster, right? Language itself sort of exhausts its reserves, right, in trying to describe what might have happened. And that is when you proceed to the language of cannibalism, right? Now, the rains in September 1770 made for a good harvest, but deaths and depopulation continued to occur. Starvation was followed, as it invariably is, by epidemics, mainly smallpox, which killed millions. Now, historians have spoken of the famine of 1770 as the greatest calamity of 18th century India, both in terms of the loss of life, but also when you think about the extent of human suffering involved, right? And so the core areas of central Bengal, including three large and well-populated districts, were devastated. Landless laborers, artisans, and boatmen without access to stocks of grain suffered the most, of course. But cultivators, who did have some access to grain, were also adversely affected because of a reduced availability of human labor, plus the death of large numbers of draft animals, right? So we are thinking here of human deaths, of course, but there is, in addition to this, right, as a supplement to this, also this sort of large number of animal deaths, right? And no one has tried to estimate, how many animals might have died in this famine. Okay. Now, it is difficult to arrive at anything like an exact death toll for the famine. Now, this is true for famines in general, as there are disputes about beginning and ending points and about calculations regarding the excess mortality that we might attribute to it. And this is especially true for historical periods where demographic accounting is sketchy, right? And then, of course, in famine also tends to derange, our normal forms of record keeping, as it were, right? So some contemporary observers put the death toll at 10 million, which was to say 1/3 of the population of the province. So did Hunter, who is, I think, even to this date, the person who has provided the most detailed account of the famine. And one century later, he felt that, he concurred with this number, with this total of 10 million. Now, it is impossible to be sure of this, and we should be wary of the seduction of such numbers, right? Especially a number like 10 million, it sounds so much nicer than, let us say, 7.25 or 6.3 or, 3.2 or something like that, right? But, in general, death tolls from famines tend to be exaggerated, right? And this is the character of famine, that it produces various kinds of hyperbole, as a kind of rhetorical and imaginative response, to the extremities to which people are driven, right? And so, we shouldn't be too hung up on the precise numbers that were killed in the famine, whether it was 10 million or 8 million, or some other number, we do not know. But it is undeniable that the suffering was on a near unimaginable scale. And as I've said before, vast areas of the province were depopulated, and they had, they remained in a state of jungle, for several decades. Now, by the time of the famine, monopolies in grain trading had been established by the company and its agents. And the company, it seems, participated, if not in creating, then at least in exacerbating the famine by monopolizing rice in anticipation of the coming scarcity. And it had no plan for dealing with the grain shortage, and whatever actions it took, were taken only to protect the mercantile and the trading classes, not the peasantry, who were the greatest sufferers. It also continued to collect taxes. Under its rule, taxes were not remitted in the event of bad harvests or worse calamities. And so, of course, this further prevented people from being able to purchase the necessary provisions. And one of the notable facts of this famine is that more revenue was collected in 1770-71, which is the year of the famine, than in 1769-70, which is the year of dearth, which resulted in famine. Now, David Arnold, in his account of the famine, asserts that it was, and I quote from him, perhaps the first Asian disaster in modern times to have had an impact on Europe. But it did so by reinforcing an identification of Asia with nature rather than by emphasizing a common humanity, end quote. Now, where Bengal had been seen initially as a land of natural bounty, it now came to be seen as susceptible to natural ravages, and its inhabitants were seen as incapable of asserting any kind of mastery over natural forces. And though some accounts did indict the company for its role in exacerbating a humanitarian disaster, the people of Bengal were also seen by many as unenlightened, too passive, too fatalistic to fend for themselves, and thus either responsible for their own suffering or apt subjects for British colonization, right, who could then fill the mouths of famine. Now, according to the report of a famine commission from 1765, when the British East India Company took over the Diwani of Bengal, to 1858, Bengal experienced 12 famines and 4 severe scarcities, though none as severe as had been experienced in 1770-71. Now, let us move to the other great Bengal famine, the one that occurred in the shadow of the Second World War, in the last years of colonial rule in the subcontinent in 1943. Now, in the intervening 175 years or so between this and the first famine, there had been several devastating famines on the subcontinent. And Mike Davis, whom some of you might have read, speaks very vividly of these in late Victorian holocausts. Now, while the death tolls from particular famines in the last quarter of the 19th century did not approach the apocalyptic mortality figures of 1770, nonetheless, their cumulative toll was about 20 million, right, in the latter part of the 19th century. So by the late 19th century, famine had become something of a byword of the failures of the colonial state, in the opinion of Indian economists and nationalists. And they noted not only the profound failures of the colonial state in providing famine relief, but also in begetting some of the conditions that had produced famine in the first place. That is to say, rigid taxation, neglect of irrigation, prevention of industrialization, privileging of landlord and moneylender interests, neglect of peasants, etc. Right? And as in the case of Ireland in the 1840s, faith in the principles of political economy and Malthusian theories of population made for a reluctance to interfere in markets or to go against what were believed to be incontrovertible natural laws of population growth. But by 1883, there was a sort of slow and grudging emergence of a famine code in India, right? And this was also updated in 1904, and this was designed to bring certain special systems of relief into play, primarily work schemes for the indigent and the distribution of free food in famine-stricken regions. And this code also identified for the first time some of the signs of impending famine, right? And they isolated 3 signs. And one was called the unusual wandering of paupers, which is to say the migration of indigent people out of famine-stricken regions, right? The second sign was a contraction of credit and feverish activity in the grain trade. And the third one was an uptick in crime. So these are the 3 signs. Now, by the 1940s then, when this second massive famine occurred, a famine code was in place, with a script for identifying signs of impending famine. There were also important conditions in the 1940s that obtained that had not been true in 1770, primarily a vast network of railways and an efficient means of communication through telegraph and telephone, right? So all the conditions that we are told that should make famine relief relatively quick and expedient, right? And yet, the famine took a massive death toll. So it might be interesting to think about what happened. Okay. So this is Bengal in 1943, right? Again, it's much smaller actually than it was in the 18th century map, but still a very large, very heavily populated region. Okay. Now, the following is a rough chronology of the famine. Can you still hear me? No? Oh, okay. At the beginning of the 1940s, the movement for Indian independence had been ongoing for half a century. And since the mid-1930s, there had been a limited degree of self-governance permitted in the several provinces, including Bengal, though the power of the provincial governments was held in check by a British governor who could veto any law that was deemed to be against national security, and who could suspend the governing body and take over its functions himself. Now, when the Second World War broke out in 1939, the colonial government in Delhi decided to prioritize Britain's war aims and to declare itself at war against the Axis powers. The Congress Party, which is really the largest party, that was involved in the nationalist movement, the Congress Party, in protest against non-consultation and the subordination of Indian interests, withdrew from the running of the elected provincial governments and therefore from cooperation with British rule. The Muslim League ministry in Bengal, however, did not resign, but it remained distinctly subordinate to the British governor of the province, as well as to British military authorities and civil servants. Now, in the meanwhile, the threat of war had become more immediate with the fall of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Burma, right, in 1942, right? And so the Japanese conquest of Burma in 1942 did, a number of things. For one thing, it cut off the imports of Burmese rice into Bengal, and it prompted terror in the colonial government, right? And so in response to the fall of Burma, the colonial government, undertook certain kinds of preventive measures, as it were, certain kinds of defensive measures. And one of them was called the boat denial scheme, right? And so, there were these very profound fears of a Japanese invasion, and the government wanted to deny potential Japanese invaders a means of transportation, should they conquer Bengal, right? And so, as a result, it decided to remove and destroy tens of thousands of boats in coastal areas, right? So this is the boat denial scheme. Now, this effectively eliminated the means of livelihood for large numbers of fishermen and the mode of transportation, and it also did away with the mode of transportation of people and goods in an area where rivers were used quite as much as roads were, for transportation. And so you find that in the famine that breaks out in the following year, that fishing communities constitute a large part of these famine mortality figures, right? In the meanwhile, you have refugees coming in by the tens of thousands from Burma into Bengal. Now, 1942 was a turbulent year for other reasons as well. The so-called Quit India political movement, which was launched by the Congress Party and widely acted upon across the country, led to political repression on a staggering scale, right? So that's one event. A second major event of 1942 was the fact that there was the cyclone in October in Mednipur, which is over here. Well, over here. The cyclone over here in 1942, and also in the adjoining 24 Parganas district, which includes Calcutta, right? And this had, of course, terrible effects on the rice crop, effects that were made much worse by the inauguration of a second British scheme, and this was the so-called rice denial scheme. Okay, and so under this rice denial scheme, cultivators were forced to sell tens of thousands of tons of grain to the government for the purposes of supplying the military and the industrial workers who were essential to the war effort. Right? And the governor of Bengal, Sir Jack Herbert, acquiesced to the denial policies without consulting with or briefing the provincial cabinet. And it's important to note that throughout, military, official, and urban priorities were privileged over local needs, including the needs of bare subsistence. Right. Now, while these exercises, the exercises of boat denial and rice denial, directly affected only a small proportion of Bengal's population, they induced widespread panic and an epidemic of hoarding. Thus, though the rice crop for 1942 was not substantially lower than the crop for the previous half-decade, and it was actually higher than the crop for 1941, which is a non-famine year, and there were no natural disasters of unprecedented scope. Despite this, prices increased exponentially over the course of 1943 as a result of this panic about scarcity and the panic about hoarding. So growers and traders withheld their stocks from the market, either out of fear of requisitioning or out of fear of price controls, or in the hope of making large profits in the face of rapidly increasing prices. And so it's developments such as these which led to the widespread sense that the famine of 1943-1944 was a so-called man-made event. And it is an analysis that has been confirmed by the voluminous scholarship on the subject, which has described the events of these years as a boom famine for at least some people, right, who profited very mightily by these, as a result of these conditions. Now, let's see. Okay. I'm going to show you a series of photographs, many of them quite disturbing, right, that are from the era. There are some extremely famous photographs that I was unable to get a hold of, at least to get a hold of in any kind of resolution that would be adequate, right? So there are these photographs which were published by this very famous photographer called Sunil Jana, and he took these photographs for the communist newspaper People's War, right? And this was instrumental in drawing people's attention to the scale of the disaster. But I wasn't able to get hold of them because his photographs are really not out in the public domain very much, right? There are also photographs from newspapers which are only available in very low resolution photographs, but so I got a number of photographs from Life magazine, which are also quite telling, shall we say. Okay. Now, within a few months of the rise in rice prices, there were widespread cases of death of starvation in at least 10 districts. And rural refugees began to pour into the cities, especially Calcutta, in the hundreds of thousands. As massive price increases put rice out of the reach of peasants, sharecroppers, fishermen, and others of the rural poor, they turned to other kinds of food and non-food items: arum roots, wild greens, snails, grass. Many sold what land they possessed in distress sales. It is estimated that the events of 1943-44 precipitated the largest transfer of land in Bengal since the early days of British rule. Household goods, cattle, tools, women's jewelry were sold for food. Large numbers of men abandoned or turned out their female dependents, including wives, sisters, and widowed relatives, and children. Of the destitutes who took to or who were forced onto the road to Calcutta, women and girls were at particular risk of sexual assault and exploitation. Large numbers of women and girls were also inducted into or took to prostitution. Some among these were kidnapped and some were sold, sometimes by their own parents. Now, the city of Calcutta, whose workers were protected from the worst effects of the famine through food subsidies and rationing, saw the influx of hundreds of thousands of starving people from the countryside, as I've noted. Very little famine relief reached the affected rural areas. And it is said, I don't know how accurately, that not one inhabitant of Calcutta or its suburbs perished as a result of the famine. They were almost all rural refugees who died. Right? So almost all of them lived on the streets. Some of them were fed, as you can see, they're waiting, in line for food at a food distribution center, and they were fed through these government-administered feeding centers and through private relief societies. Though observers, as well as famine sufferers, often complained about the quality and the purity of the food, alleging that it exacerbated or induced stomach problems. But this feeding was far from sufficient to feed the large numbers of starving people in the city, many of whom succumbed. Now, for much of the duration of the famine, the governments at Delhi and Whitehall remained impervious to the problems of Bengal, accusing Bengalis of over-dramatizing the situation. Churchill, whose dislike of Gandhi in particular and of Hindus in general, whom he called beastly people with a beastly religion, and then the beastliest people in the world next to the Germans, notoriously refused to make ships available for the emergency transportation of food grains from Canada, the United States, and Australia, all of whom offered food aid. As in the case of the Irish famine of the 1840s, when the Irish were blamed for marrying too early, having too many children, relying too much on one kind of crop, Bengalis were suspected of being seditious and, in Churchill's Malthusian formulation, of breeding like rabbits. The viceroy at the outbreak of the famine never visited Bengal, and in fact, the famine code was never invoked, as, in the interest of maintaining morale during wartime. Right? And a strict censorship of Indian papers also ensured that news of the famine did not come in the way of war efforts being conducted from Westminster and Whitehall. Now, it must be said that the next viceroy, Lord Wavell, was in fact extremely responsive to what was happening during the famine, and he made great efforts, to provide relief and, to see what was going on the ground. Now, I'm going to wrap it up in about 5 minutes, since I see that, time is not my friend over here. Okay, so the provincial government in Calcutta also proved remarkably inept at dealing with the tragedy. Law and order, however, remained unthreatened through it all. People starved to death in front of food shops guarded by the police, and an efficient and far-flung railway system ensured not the transportation of grains into Bengal or the speedy migration of the famine-stricken to more prosperous areas, but the transportation of food grains out of famine-stricken areas by hoarders and profiteers. Right? Again, not dissimilar to what happens in Ireland in the 1840s. When the crisis was hastily declared to have ended in late 1943 after an unprecedentedly large winter harvest of rice in 43-44, most of the rural refugees were forcibly repatriated to their homes. But the period of recovery was prolonged and uncertain as the rural population contended with epidemics of smallpox, cholera, and malaria. And scholars suggest that the endpoint of famine should be seen not as 1944, when it was the state declared that it had ended, but rather as mid-1946, right? Because famine by its nature has these staggered effects, as you know. Right? Okay, now there are different estimates of the mortality figures for the famine, for this famine. The Famine Inquiry Commission, which convened in 1944, arrived at a death toll of 1945, which was later decided to be too low. And Amartya Sen, who is, of course, the preeminent scholar, right, of the economics of famine, and who has revolutionized the scholarship on famine, estimates that about 3 million people in total died, right? And this takes into account the staggered mortality effect of famine as a consequence of malnutrition, lowered resistance to disease, etc. Right? And, I want to say a word about him, since his work on the famine is one of the preeminent effects of the famine, right? And so Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winning economist, the author of Poverty and Famines, has, as I've said, revolutionized our commonsensical understanding of famine. Now, famine was seen, famously by Malthus as a matter of figures, right? So populations grow in geometrical or exponential progression. Food resources, on the other hand, proceed according to an arithmetical logic, and there is an immutable clash between the two, right? And such an understanding of famine as a problem of reconciling this clash of numbers has been called into question by the work of Amartya Sen, right? And he was a boy in Bengal during the time of the famine and was profoundly influenced by it. And in his work on poverty and famines, this is one of the 3 famines that he showcases, right? And he seeks in this work to showcase the ways in which the subject of famine brings into visibility, in a particularly striking way, questions of equity and access, and not just questions of scarcity and plenty, right? And he says that, he suggests that famine has to do not just with numbers, but what he describes as entitlements, right? And so he has argued with considerable persuasiveness that modern famines are not caused in any fundamental way by a simple lack of food or other ecological disturbances, such as droughts or floods, or by the lack of transportation. Sometimes famine can occur even when there is no diminution in the quantities of food available, right? And droughts, floods, crop disease, and shortfalls in production might create the proximate conditions for the onset of famine, but they cannot explain why some people come to starve, sometimes to death, right? And examining the data from 1943, he concluded that the decline in food availability for that year was actually relatively small. And so the famine was a result of market failures and failures of state policy. He is also notable for the related conclusion that democratic regimes, with their free press and notions of electoral accountability, are less hospitable to famine than are non-democratic and totalitarian ones. Now, there's been some dispute about that. Now, um, the famine of 1943 produced a sort of extraordinary outpouring in terms of literature, fiction, poetry, drama, visual culture of various kinds, film, sketches, etc., ethnography, and so on, which is we don't really have time to talk about right now. But I just wanted to show you some of the work of the artists of the famine. All right. So rather abruptly, I will stop now. And if you have questions, I'm sure you have millions, please, this would be the time. One always thinks one can say so much more in a given time. You think time is much more elastic than it actually is. So, and I keep discovering that. One would think that I would have learned it by now, but it doesn't take.
All right, we have time for a few questions.
Yes.
So we saw from your talk and the earlier talk, iconography, the pictures and stuff are usually feminine. There's a gender element to them. The pictures are usually women and children.
Yeah.
Does that correlate to the reality of it, that the people who are dying disproportionately are women and children also?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. And in fact, when we look at mortality figures, for the famines that are available to us, I mean, as I've said, I mean, mortality figures are very difficult to calculate, right? And it depends on, whom you talk to, etc. I mean, where your ethnographic work is done, from where you collect data, the reliability of the data, and so on. But in general, women tend to survive famines at a slightly higher rate than men. Higher rate than men, yes, that is in fact true. This was true for the Bengal famine. This was true for, the Great Hunger in Ireland in the 1840s, and that has been true for most of the famines for which there have been reliable records, right? And so there is a certain disconnect, if you will, between the reality of gender death, right, and the way in which it's represented. And very often you find, or at least in the 19th and 20th centuries, in the work that comes out of the Irish famine in the 1840s and the Bengal famine in the 1940s, though famine is often represented in markedly gendered ways, right? And so sometimes famine is itself a female figure, right? A certain kind of terrifying female figure, right, of devastation. Right? That's one kind of iconography. But often when you speak about the devastations of famine, the subjects who are chosen are women, and either women who are sexually vulnerable, or it is mothers, right? So motherhood is also a very large part of the iconography of famine, right? And part of the pathos of famine is supposed to be this incapacity of mothers to feed their children, right? And that, is meant to figure the sort of complete breakdown of some kind of natural order, as it were, right? And so you find this coming up again and again and again across a variety of genres. It comes up to a large degree in the literature, right? But it also, you find that in the visual records, whether you're looking at photographs taken for newspapers, or sketches and so on. And these are conveyed with greater or lesser degrees of sentimentality, right? And so the sketches that we saw towards the end by Zainul Abidin, are, I think, quite non-sentimental, even though they feature, women primarily as sufferers from famine. But, it's a kind of a nice, unsentimental look at them. But in many other forms of visual culture actually render, mothers who are famine victims, and especially, with a great deal of sentimentality, and, using not just the visual records, but also captions, in order to highlight a certain kind of pathos. Yeah.
I have two questions. The Indian casualties in World War II.
Yeah.
That's not spoken about much. All the Indians who died abroad or wherever they were
Right.
fighting. And then I wanted to see if you could speak some more about Burma.
Okay.
The refugees were coming because they were bombed in
Yeah.
World War II.
Yeah.
And that's not spoken about too much either, in my opinion, when I read Kipling's.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I'd spoken of the famine as a forgotten famine, but in fact, there are many forgotten narratives over here, right? Yeah, and there is a sort of considerable Indian death toll in both the world wars, as it were, right? But it is not spoken of very much either in the world at large or even in India. India has actually very little interest, in chronicling, those soldiers who fought in the Second World War and who died and so on. And there are, in fact, various battlefields in the Northeast where there were these, fairly important military engagements between British Indian troops and Japanese troops, with certain Indian conscripts and so on. And again, nothing much has been made of them. And there is a way in which, for India, World War II gets erased in favor of a nationalist movement which is sort of moving towards its goal, as it were, right? It's moving towards 1947, and you cannot see anything else, right? And so it's overwritten by that. It's also, overwritten by multiple tragedies. One is, of course, the famine, but the other is, what happens in 1947, which is not just independence, but also devastatingly brutal partition, right, with its own extremely high death rates and tales of brutality, right? And so, and so it gets overwritten by that. It's same thing for Burma. If you want to look at, for materials on Burma, you have to look to the fiction, really. And I'm thinking of Amitav Ghosh's novel, The Glass Palace, which is precisely about this moment, about the movement of refugees from Burma into India and that sort of long, tortuous path that they take. Right.
Were they repatriated, or they just kind of got lost in the people who came from Burma?
Well, some of them were repatriated, but not that many. Not that many, yeah. Ghosh talks about, certain people from the royal family of Burma, for instance, who end up on the southwestern coast of India, right? But most other refugees had to make do, and yeah.
Philip Montgomery led a large number of Indian troops in North Africa.
Right.
And fought against the Germans in Tobruk and all that.
Right.
In fact, Montgomery used to wear two insignias. One is the Philip Montgomery Royal Army.
Okay.
The other one was, I think, the second Gurkha Battalion.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay.
And a large number of those troops, a certain number were captured with the Germans.
Okay.
And then at the fall of Singapore, a large number of Indians were capture
Right.
Indian troops, and
Right.
they formed the basis of the Indian National
Right.
Army
Right.
with Subhash Bose and
Right.
leading.
Right.
So the consciousness of Second World War, I was a child and I remember a little bit in Calcutta. People were singing on the street that, look how the Japanese are bombing and British are running
Yeah,
in fear.
yeah.
So it was not
Yeah, yeah.
anti-Japanese.
Right, yeah.
In fact, they're cheering on an Asian power.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
winning against the Western.
Right, exactly.
So that, but in general, I think it was about 3 million Indian troops fought in Second World War.
Okay.
They fought in Italy.
Right.
With the British troops who were going up the
Right.
of Italy, and North Africa. And
Right.
in Burma. In fact, the Japanese are very good jungle fighters.
Right.
So the British Second Division would not hold them. They had to send in the hill tribes from India,
Okay.
both from northwest India as well as Gorkhas,
Right.
to finally stabilize the front.
Right.
Japanese came 50 miles inside India,
Okay.
so they stopped there.
Right.
And I remember seeing a big statue, picture of a big statue of a tiger of the Italian coast. It was set up in memorial of the Indian guy
Ah, I see.
by the Allies. I don't
Okay,
know, but
okay.
there it is. But you're right, I mean, there's no real consciousness of Second World War.
Right.
It's subsumed in the context of 520.
Right.
I'm going to step in because we have a credit group meeting that has to take place, but thank you so much. It was
Thank you.